Dr. Lawrence Dunegan's reminiscences of off-the-record remarks made by an Illuminati insider, Dr. Richard Day, on March 20, 1969. Dr. Dunegan's statements were recorded by Randy Engel, National Director of the U.S. Coalition for Life, in 1988. Dr. Dunegan claims he attended a medical meeting on March 20, 1969 where Richard Day made off-the-record remarks during an address at the Pittsburgh Pediatric Society to a meeting of students and health professionals. Dr. Dunegan details Dr. Day's credentials. These clearly show that Dr. Day was an establishment insider privy to the overarching plan of the elite which rules the Western world and which is working toward the creation of a world dictatorship. This proposed global tyranny is usually called the New World Order and will comprise a secular and a spiritual component, a one-world government and a one-world religion. Most analysts of this plan describe it as Lucifer's totalitarian world empire. Before he began his talk, Dr. Day asked everyone to turn off all tape recorders and stop taking notes so that he could tell them what was going to happen in the future. Dr. Dunegan, sensing Dr. Day's message would be important, ignored the request and noted the points made by him on a set of table napkins. He later wrote up these notes, which formed the basis for 3 tapes. The notes taken by Dunegan reveal, not just what is planned for the entire population of the planet, but how this evil cabal intends to carry out their plan. Anyone who has studied the plan will recognize that Dr. Day's remarks are essentially a reiteration of the secret agenda being followed by the global elite. This agenda includes the elimination of swaths of humanity by promoting ill health and spurious medical treatments, while at the same time suppressing effective treatments for disease and deliberately introducing man-made pathogens. Throughout his talk, Dr. Day justified his observations by using a philosophy founded upon a spurious theory made famous by the English natural scientist, Charles Darwin, namely evolution by natural selection. The German philosopher Friedrich Wilhelm Nietzsche, best remembered for his concept of the Superman and for his rejection of Christian values, was one of the philosophical giants of this movement. Dr. Day, an ardent atheist, was a spokesman for those who view human existence as merely an extension of the jungle, and whose self-appointed task is to safeguard what advances have been made to date by humans, epitomized by Western civilization. This involves eliminating weaknesses and degeneracy from the human gene pool. The aim in doing so is not only to preserve what advances humanity has made in this evolutionary process but to help it along. This pernicious philosophy is utterly inimical to the true, God-given purpose of creation and the natural moral order founded by the will of God. Amongst the hitherto secret plans which Dr. Day outlined was the revolution in morals that had shaken Western society to its foundations. This would usher in a new world religion, the one world religion of the New World Order. This would actually be brought about by the churches themselves, especially the Roman Catholic Church. Moreover, he discussed bringing the U.S. to the brink of nuclear war and the cynical use of terrorism to bring about a one-world government. At that time he indicated that there is much more cooperation between East and West than most people realize. In his introductory remarks he commented that he was free to speak at this time because, and I'm quoting, "everything is in place and nobody can stop us now." He went on to say that most people don't understand how governments operate and even people in high positions in governments don't really understand how and where decisions are made. He went on to say that people who really influence decisions are names that, for the most part, would be familiar to most of us, but he would not use individuals' names or names of any specific organization. But, if he did, most of the people would be names that were recognized by most of his audience. He went on to say that they were not primarily people in public office, but people of prominence who were primarily known in their private occupations or private positions. A comment that was made from time to time during the presentation was, "People are too trusting. People don't ask the right questions." Sometimes, being too trusting was equated with being too dumb. But sometimes when he would say that and say, "People don't ask the right questions," it was almost with a sense of regret, as if he were uneasy with what he was part of, and wished that people would challenge it and maybe not be so trusting. Population control. He said the population was growing too fast. Numbers of people living at any one time on the planet must be limited or we will run out of space to live. We will outgrow our food supply and we will overpollute the world with our waste. Permission to have babies. People won't be allowed to have babies just because they want to or because they are careless. Most families would be limited to 2. Some people would be allowed only 1, and the outstanding person or persons might be selected and allowed to have 3. But most people would be allowed to have only 2 babies. That's because the zero population growth rate is 2.1 children per completed family. Sex without reproduction and reproduction without sex. From population control, the natural next step then was sex. He said sex must be separated from reproduction. Sex is too pleasurable, and the urges are too strong, to expect people to give it up. Chemicals in food and in the water supply to reduce the sex drive is not practical. The strategy then would be not to diminish sex activity, but to increase sex activity, but in such a way that people won't be having babies. Contraception universally available to all. Contraception would be very strongly encouraged, and it would be connected so closely in people's minds with sex, that they would automatically think contraception when they were thinking or preparing for sex. Contraception would be made universally available. Contraceptives would be displayed much more prominently in drugstores, right up with the cigarettes and chewing gum. This kind of openness was a way of suggesting that contraceptives were just as much a part of life as any other item sold in the store. Contraceptives would be advertised and dispensed in schools in association with sex education. Sex education as a tool of world government. The sex education was to get kids interested early, making the connection between sex and the need for contraception early in their lives, even before they became very active. The idea then is that the connection between sex and contraception introduced and reinforced in school would carry over into marriage. Indeed, if young people, when they matured, decided to get married, marriage itself would be diminished in importance. He indicated some recognition that most people probably would want to be married, but that this certainly would not be any longer considered necessary for sexual activity. Tax-funded abortion as population control. No surprise then, that the next item was abortion. Abortion will no longer be a crime. Abortion will be accepted as normal and would be paid for by taxes for people who could not pay for their own abortions. Encouraging homosexuality, sex, anything goes. Homosexuality also was to be encouraged. People will be given permission to be homosexual. That's the way it was stated. They won't have to hide it. Elderly people will be encouraged to continue to have active sex lives into the very old age. Everyone will be given permission to have sex, to enjoy however they want. Anything goes. This is the way it was put. Clothing was mentioned. Clothing styles would be made more stimulating and provocative. He said, it is not just the amount of skin that is exposed that makes clothing sexually seductive, but other, more subtle things are often suggestive, things like movement, and the cut of clothing, and the kind of fabric, the positioning of accessories on the clothing. If a woman has an attractive body, why should she not show it? Was one of his statements. Technology. He said sex and reproduction would be separated. You would have sex without reproduction, and then technology was reproduction without sex. This would be done in the laboratory. He indicated that already, much research was underway about making babies in the laboratory. Families to diminish in importance. Divorce would be made easier and more prevalent. Most people who marry will marry more than once. More people will not marry. Unmarried people would stay in hotels and even live together. That would be very common. Nobody would even ask questions about it. It would be widely accepted as no different from married people being together. More women will work outside the home. More men will be transferred to other cities, and in their jobs, more men would travel. Therefore, it would be harder for families to stay together. Euthanasia. The old are no longer useful. They become a burden. You should be ready to accept death. Most people are. An arbitrary age limit could be established. After all, you have a right to only so many steak dinners, so many orgasms, and so many good pleasures in life. And after you have had enough of them and you are no longer productive, working, and contributing, then you should be ready to step aside for the next generation. Limiting access to affordable medical care makes eliminating the elderly easier. Medical care would be connected very closely with one's work, but also would be made very high in cost so that it would simply be unavailable to people beyond a certain time. And unless they had a remarkably rich, supporting family, they would just have to do without care. Planning the control over medicine. Medical care would be closely connected to work. If you don't work or can't work, you won't have access to medical care. The days of hospitals giving away free care would gradually wind down, to where it was virtually non-existent. Costs would be forced up so that people won't be able to afford to go without insurance. People pay. You pay for it, you're entitled to it. Use of hospitals. Anybody moving about in a hospital would be required to wear an identification badge with photograph, telling why they were there, employee or lab technician or visitor or whatever. This is to be brought in gradually, getting everybody used to the idea of identifying themselves, until it was just accepted. This need for ID to move about would start in small ways, hospitals, some businesses, but gradually expand to include everybody in all places. Elimination of private doctors. The doctor would be gradually recognized as a highly skilled technician and his job would change. The job would include things like executions by lethal injection. The image of the doctor being a powerful, independent person would have to be changed. He went on to say, doctors are making entirely too much money. New difficult to diagnose and untreatable diseases. He said new diseases would appear which had never been seen before. These would be very difficult to diagnose and would be untreatable, at least for a long time. Suppressing cancer cures as a means of population control. We can cure almost every cancer right now. Information is on file. But if people stop dying of cancer, how rapidly we would become overpopulated. Efforts at cancer treatment would be geared more toward comfort than toward cure. Inducing heart attacks as a form of assassination. He said, there is now a way to simulate a real heart attack. It can be used as a means of assassination. With regard to exercise, he went on to say that more people would be exercising more, especially running, because everybody can run. You don't need any special equipment or place. You can run wherever you are. As he put it, people will be running all over the place. And in this vein, he pointed out how supply produces demand. And this was in reference to athletic clothing and equipment. As this would be made more widely available and glamorized, particularly as regards running shoes, this would stimulate people to develop an interest in running and, as part of a public propaganda campaign, people would be encouraged to buy attractive sports equipment and get into exercise. In connection with nutrition, he also mentioned that public eating places would rapidly increase. This had a connection with the family too. As more and more people ate out, eating at home would become less important. People would be less dependent on their kitchens at home. And then this also connected to convenience foods being made widely available, things you could pop in the microwave. Whole meals would be available prefixed. Education as a tool for accelerating the onset of puberty and evolution. Somewhere in here there was also something about accelerating the onset of puberty. And this was said in connection with health, and later in connection with education and to accelerating the process of evolutionary change. Blending all religions, the old religions will have to go. Another area of discussion was religion. This is an avowed atheist speaking. And he said, religion is not necessarily bad. A lot of people seem to need religion, with its mysteries and rituals, so they will have religion. But the major religions of today have to be changed because they are not compatible with the changes to come. The old religions will have to go. Especially Christianity. Once the Roman Catholic Church is brought down, the rest of Christianity will follow easily. Then a new religion can be accepted for use all over the world. It will incorporate something from all of the older ones to make it easier for people to accept and feel at home in it. Most people won't be too concerned with religion. They will realize that they don't need it. Changing the Bible through the revision of key words. In order to do this, the Bible will be changed. It will be rewritten to fit the new religion. Gradually, key words will be replaced with new words having various shades of meaning. Then, the meaning attached to the new word can be close to the old word. And as time goes on, other shades of meaning of that word can be emphasized, and then gradually that word replaced with another word. But the idea is that everything in Scripture need not be rewritten, just keywords replaced by other words. And the variability in meaning attached to any word can be used as a tool to change the entire meaning of Scripture, and therefore make it acceptable to this new religion. Most people won't know the difference, and this was another one of those times where he said, the few who do notice the difference won't be enough to matter. The churches will help. Then followed one of the most surprising statements of the whole presentation. He said, some of you probably think the churches won't stand for this, and he went on to say, The churches will help us. There was no elaboration on this. It was unclear just what he had in mind when he said, "The churches will help us." In retrospect, I think some of us now can understand what he might have meant at that time. I recall then only of thinking, "No, they won't." And remembering our Lord's words where he said to Peter, "Thou art Peter, and upon this rock I will build my church, and gates of hell will not prevail against it." So yes, some people in the churches might help. And in the subsequent 20 years we've seen how some people in churches have helped. But we also know that our Lord's words will stand, and the gates of hell will not prevail. Restructuring education as a tool of indoctrination. In addition to changing the Bible, he said that the classics in literature would be changed. He said, the casual reader reading a revised version of a classic would never even suspect that there was any change. Somebody would have to go it through word by word to even recognize that any change was made in any of these classics. The changes would be so subtle. But the changes would be such as to promote the acceptability of the new system. More time in schools, but they wouldn't learn anything. As regards education, he indicated that kids would spend more time in schools, but in many schools they wouldn't learn anything. They'll learn some things, but not as much as formerly. Better schools in better areas with better people, their kids will learn more. In the better schools, learning would be accelerated. And this is another time where he said, we think we can push evolution. By pushing kids to learn more, he seemed to be suggesting that their brains would evolve, that their offspring would evolve, sort of pushing evolution, where kids would learn and be more intelligent at a younger age. As if this pushing would alter their physiology. Overall, schooling would be prolonged. This meant prolonged through the school year. Students would have to decide at a younger age what they would want to study and get onto their track early, if they would qualify. It would be harder to change to another field of study once you get started. Studies would be concentrated in much greater depth, but narrowed. You wouldn't have access to material in other fields, outside your own area of study, without approval. Controlling who has access to information. He was already talking about computers in education, and at that time he said anybody who wanted computer access, or access to books that were not directly related to their field of study would have to have a very good reason for so doing. Otherwise, access would be denied. Schools as the hub of the community. Schooling would become more important in people's overall life. Kids, in addition to their academic needs, would have to get into school activities unless they wanted to feel completely out of it. Now the pressures of the accelerated academic program, the accelerated demands, where kids would feel they had to be part of something, one or another athletic club or some school activity, these pressures he recognized would cause some students to burn out. He said, the smartest ones will learn how to cope with pressures and to survive. In this connection, and later on in connection with drug abuse and alcohol abuse, he indicated that psychiatric services would be increased dramatically. Education would be lifelong. Adults would continue going to school. There'll always be new information that adults must have to keep up. When you can't keep up anymore, you're too old. This was another way of letting older people know that the time had come for them to move on and take the death pill. Some books would just disappear from the libraries. This was in the vein that some books contain information or contain ideas that should not be kept around. And therefore, those books would disappear. Changing laws. Another area of discussion was laws that would be changed. At that time a lot of states had blue laws about Sunday sales, certain Sunday activities. He said the blue laws would all be repealed, that is, cancelled, annulled, revoked. Encouragement of drug abuse to create a jungle atmosphere. Drug use would be increased. Alcohol use would be increased. Law enforcement efforts against drugs would be increased. On first hearing that, it sounded like a contradiction. Why increase drug abuse and simultaneously increase law enforcement against drug abuse? But the idea is that, in part, the increased availability of drugs would provide a sort of law of the jungle whereby the weak and the unfit would be selected out. There was a statement made at the time. Before the earth was overpopulated, there was a law of the jungle where only the fittest survived. You had to be able to protect yourself against the elements and wild animals and disease. And if you were fit, you survived. But now we've become so civilized, we're over-civilized, and the unfit are able to survive, only at the expense of those who are more fit. And the abuse of drugs then, would restore, in a certain sense, the law of the jungle, and selection of the fittest for survival. Alcohol abuse. The same thing would happen with alcohol. Alcohol abuse would be both promoted and demoted at the same time. The vulnerable and the weak would respond to the promotions and, therefore, use and abuse more alcohol. Restrictions on travel. Overall restrictions on travel will occur. The need for more jails, and using hospitals as jails. More jails would be needed. Hospitals could serve as jails. Change. Nothing is permanent. Streets would be rerouted, renamed. Areas you had not seen in a while would become unfamiliar. Among other things, this would contribute to older people feeling that it was time to move on. They feel they couldn't even keep up with the changes in areas that were once familiar. Buildings would be allowed to stand empty and deteriorate, and streets would be allowed to deteriorate in certain localities. The purpose of this was to provide a jungle feeling, depressed atmosphere for the unfit. Somewhere in this same connection he mentioned that buildings and bridges would be made so that they would collapse after a while. There would be more accidents involving airplanes and railroads and automobiles. All of this to contribute to the feeling of insecurity, that nothing was safe. Global interdependence. The stated plan was that different parts of the world would be assigned different roles in industry and commerce in a unified global system. The continued preeminence of the United States and the relative independence and self-sufficiency of the United States would have to be changed. This was one of several occasions where he said that, in order to create a new structure, you first have to tear down the old. American industry was one example of that. The United States system would have to be curtailed in order to give other countries a chance to build their industries, because otherwise they would not be able to compete against the United States. And this was especially true of the U.S. heavy industries. They would be cut back while the same industries were being developed in other countries, notably Japan. Patriotism would go down the drain. Loss of jobs, loss of security. The idea was to promote insecurity. The notion that the world wasn't a terribly reliable place. The United States was to be kept strong in information, communications, high technology, education and agriculture. It would continue to be sort of the keystone of the global system. But heavy industry would be transported out. Population shifts to eliminate traditions. Population shifts were to be brought about so that people would tend to move into the Sun Belt. They would be, sort of, people without roots in their new locations, and traditions are easier to change in a place where there are a lot of transplanted people, as compared to trying to changing traditions in a place where people grew up and had an extended family, where they had roots. World citizens, world sports. Sports in the United States were to be changed, in part as a way of de-emphasizing nationalism. Soccer, a worldwide sport, was to be emphasized and pushed in the United States. Soccer is seen as an international sport and would be promoted, and the traditional sport of American baseball would be de-emphasized and possibly eliminated because it might be seen as too American. Sports for girls, to de-emphasize femininity. Very important in sports was sports for girls. Athletics would be pushed for girls. This was intended to replace dolls. Baby dolls would still be around, a few of them, but you would not see the number and variety of dolls. Dolls would not be pushed because girls should not be thinking about babies and reproduction. Girls should be out on the athletic field just as the boys are. Girls and boys really need not to be all that different. D-sets were to go the way of dolls, and all these things that traditionally were thought of as feminine would be de-emphasized as girls got into more masculine pursuits. Entertainment, violence, sex, and desensitization. Movies would gradually be made more explicit as regards sex and language. Violence would be made more graphic. This was intended to desensitize people to violence. There might need to be a time when people would witness real violence and be a part of it. Later on it will become clear where this is headed. So there would be more realistic violence in entertainment, which would make it easier for people to adjust. People's attitudes towards death would change, and they would not be so fearful of it but more accepting of it, and not be so aghast at the sight of dead people or injured people. We don't need to have a genteel population paralyzed by what they might see. People would just learn to say, well, I don't want that to happen to me. Music will get worse. He made a rather straightforward statement. Music will get worse. Lyrics would become more openly sexual. No new sugary romantic music would be publicized. Older folks would refuse to hear the junk that was offered to young people, and young people would accept the junk because it identified them as their generation and helped them feel distinct from the older generation. He also indicated all the old movies would be brought back. This was stated to be sort of a reward for the generation which had grown up through the Depression and had survived the rigors of World War II. They had deserved it to help ease them through their final years in comfort. Travel restrictions, national ID, the chip. In the late 80s and early 90s things would tighten up and the tightening up would be accelerated. The old movies and old songs would be withdrawn, the gentler entertainment would be withdrawn. Travel, instead of being easy for old folks, would become very restricted. People would need permission to travel and they would need a good reason. If you didn't have a good reason for travel you would not be allowed and everyone would need ID. This would at first be an ID card you would carry on your person and you must show when asked for it. It was already planned that later on some sort of device would be developed to be implanted under the skin that would be coded specifically to identify the individual. This would eliminate the possibility of false ID and also eliminate the possibility of people saying, "Well, I lost my ID." The difficulty with these skin-implanted IDs, he said, would be getting material that would stay in or under the skin without causing foreign body reaction, whereby the body would reject it or cause infection. His would have to be material on which information could be recorded and retrieved by some sort of scanner while it was not rejected by the body. Silicon was mentioned. Silicon at that time was thought to be well tolerated. Food control. Food supplies would come under tight control. If population growth didn't slow down, food shortages could be created in a hurry and people would realize the dangers of overpopulation. Weather control. There was a mention then of weather. He said, "We can or soon will be able to control the weather." Weather was seen as a weapon of war, a weapon of influencing public policy. It could make rain or withhold rain in order to influence certain areas and bring them under control. He said, "On the one hand you can make drought during the growing season so that nothing will grow, and on the other hand you can make for very heavy rains during harvest season so the fields are too muddy to bring in the harvest, and indeed one might be able to do both." Politics. He said that very few people really know how government works. Something to the effect that elected officials are influenced in ways they don't even realize, and they carry out plans that have been made for them, and they think that they are authors of the plans. But actually they are manipulated in ways they don't understand. Know how people respond, making them do what you want. He said. People can carry in their minds and act upon two contradictory ideas at one time, provided that these two contradictory ideas are kept far enough apart. You can know pretty well how rational people are going to respond to certain circumstances or to certain information that they encounter. So, to determine the response you want, you need only control the kind of data or information that they're presented or the kinds of circumstance that they're in, and being rational people they'll do what you want them to do. They may not fully understand what they're doing or why. Falsified scientific research. Somewhere in this was a statement admitting that some scientific research data could be, and indeed had been, falsified in order to bring about desired results. Dr. Day said, "People don't ask the right questions. Some people are too trusting." Acceptance of the UN, the end justifies the means. Acceptance of the UN at that time was not as widespread as they had hoped. Efforts would continue to give the United Nations increasing importance. People would be more and more used to the idea of relinquishing some national sovereignty. Economic interdependence would foster this goal from a peaceful standpoint. Avoidance of war would foster it from the standpoint of worrying about hostilities. It was recognized that doing it peaceably was better than doing it by war. The new system would be brought in, if not by peaceful cooperation, everybody willingly yielding national sovereignty, then by bringing the nation to the brink of nuclear war. Everybody would be so fearful as hysteria is created by the possibility of nuclear war that there would be a strong public outcry to negotiate a public peace and people would willingly give up national sovereignty in order to achieve peace. This would therefore bring in the new international political system. War is good, cannon fodder, keep the population down, and die a hero. War is obsolete. Dr. Day said that there were some good things about war. 1. You're going to die anyway. And people sometimes get a chance in war to display great courage and heroism, and if they die they've died well, and if they survive they get recognition. If many millions of casualties in World War I and World War II had not died and continued to have babies, there would be millions upon millions more people on the planet and we would already be overpopulated. So those two wars served the purpose in delaying overpopulation. But now there are technological means the individual and governments can use to control overpopulation, so in this regard war is obsolete. It's no longer needed. It's obsolete because nuclear weapons could destroy the whole universe. Terrorism, the great tool for control. Terrorism would be used widely in Europe and in other parts of the world. Terrorism at that time was not considered necessary in the United States. However, it could become necessary in the US if they did not move rapidly enough toward accepting the system. Money and banking. One statement was, inflation is infinite. You can put an infinite number of zeros after any number and put the decimals points wherever you want, as an indication that inflation is a tool of the controllers. Money would become predominantly credit. Money was primarily a credit thing, but the exchange of money would not be in the form of cash or something palpable but an electronic credit signal. People would carry money only in very small amounts for things like chewing gum and candy bars. Any purchase of any significant amount would be done electronically. Earnings would be electronically entered into your account. It would be a single banking system. It may have the appearance of being more than that, but ultimately it would be one single banking system. So when you got paid, your pay would be entered for you into your account balance, and then when you purchased anything at the point of purchase it would be deducted from your account balance and you would actually carry nothing around with you. Also, computer records could be kept of whatever it was you purchased, so that if you were purchasing too much of any particular item and some official wanted to know what you were doing with your money, they could go back and review your purchases and determine what you were buying. Dr. Day stated that any purchase of significant size like an automobile, bicycle, a refrigerator, a radio, television or whatever might have some sort of identification on it so it could be traced, so that very quickly anything which was either given away or stolen, whatever, the authorities would be able to establish who purchased it and when. Computers would allow this to happen. The ability to save would be greatly curtailed. People would just not be able to save any considerable degree of wealth. He made a statement which recognized that wealth represents power, and wealth in the hands of a lot of people is not good for the people in charge, so if you save too much you might be taxed. The more you save, the higher rate of tax on your savings, so your savings really could never get very far. And also, if you began to show a pattern of saving too much, you might have your pay cut. We would say, well, you're saving instead of spending. You really don't need all that money. Basically, the idea was to prevent people from accumulating any wealth which might have a long-range disruptive influence on the system. People would be encouraged to use credit, to borrow, and then also to renege on their debt, so they would destroy their own credit. The idea here is that if credit can't be handled wisely, this gives the authorities the opportunity to come down hard on you. Electronic payments initially would all be based on different kinds of credit cards. The advantage of having all of that combined into a single credit card would be emphasized, serving a single monetary system, and then you wouldn't have to carry around all that plastic. So the next step would be the single card, and then the next step after that would be to replace the single card with a skin implant. The single card could be lost or stolen, it could give rise to problems, or it could be exchanged with somebody else to confuse identify. The skin implant on the other hand would be not lost, counterfeited or transferable to another person, so you and your accounts would be identified without possibility of error. The skin implants would have to be put someplace that would be convenient for the skin, for example your right hand or your forehead. The speaker went on to say, "Now some of you people who read the Bible will attach significance to this to the Bible," but he went on to disclaim any biblical significance at all. This is just common sense. This is how the system could work and should work, and there's no need to read any superstitious biblical principles into it. Big Brother is watching you, while you're watching TV. There was some mention of implants that would lend themselves to surveillance by providing radio signals. This could be placed under the skin or, via, a dental implant put in like a filling so that either fugitives or possibly other citizens could be identified by a certain frequency from his personal transmitter and could be located at any time or any place by any authority who wanted to find him. This would be particularly useful for somebody who broke out of prison. There was more discussion of personal surveillance. Television sets would have a device to enable this to happen. The TV set would not have to be on in order for this to be operative. Also, the television set could be used to monitor what you are watching. People could tell what you're watching on TV and how you're reacting to what you're watching. And you would not know that you were being watched while you were watching your television. How would we get people to accept these things into their homes? Well, people would buy them when they buy their own television. They won't know that they're in there at first. This was described by what we now know as cable TV, which has replaced antenna TV. When you buy a TV set, this monitor would just be part of the set, and most people would not have enough knowledge to know it was there in the beginning. The cable would be the means of carrying the surveillance message to the monitor. By the time people found out that this monitoring was going on, they would also be very dependent upon television for a number of things. Just the way people are dependent upon the telephone today. Privately owned homes, a thing of the past. Privately owned housing would become a thing of the past. The cost of housing and financing housing would gradually be made so high that most people couldn't afford it. People who already owned their houses would be allowed to keep them, but as years go by it would be more and more difficult for young people to buy a house. Young people would more and more become renters, particularly in apartments or condominiums. More and more unsold houses would stand vacant. People just couldn't buy them. But the cost of housing would not come down. The bringing in of the new system, he said, would probably occur on a weekend in the winter. Everything would shut down on Friday evening, and Monday morning, when everybody woke up, there would be an announcement that the new system was in place. During the process of getting the United States ready for these changes, everybody would be busier, with less leisure time and less opportunity to really look about and see what was going on around them. Also, there would be more changes and more difficulty in keeping up as far as one's investments were concerned. Investment instruments would be changing. Interest rates would be changing, so it would be difficult to keep up with what you had already earned. The sexualization of the population, which Dr. Day spoke about, anything goes, is something we are now seeing. For example, it's not so much that someone would adopt the homosexual lifestyle for himself, but as a result of the propaganda he will certainly be a lot more tolerant of that type of behavior. So it's a desensitization, even if the individual doesn't go over and accept it for himself. With the power of propaganda, you dare not be against homosexuals, otherwise you get labeled a homophobe. You dare not be against any of our feminist programs for women, otherwise you're a male chauvinist. It's like anti-Semitism. If this label gets enough currency in a culture, then people get stuck with it. So it's easier to keep quiet. Surveillance today is even more sophisticated. It would be pretty hard for anybody to escape and say, well, I'm just going to go out into the mountains and be a hermit and escape the New World Order. I can shoot deer and eat berries and survive, and I've got a wife who's pretty sturdy and she'll be able to survive, and we'll do what the Indians did before Columbus got here and we'll all survive. The New World Order will say, no you won't, because we're going to find you.
Ladies and gentlemen, to make the history of the great conspiracy both clear and convincing, we need 100 volumes of 1,000 pages each. And we hope that those scholarly volumes will all be written in due course as a guide and a warning to future generations. But at present we have a more immediate and more urgent task. We want to give you simply an outline of the progress of this organized evil force from its beginning up to the present time. The aim of the conspirators always has been and still is to impose the brutal tyranny of their rule over the whole human race. Today, they are at last within striking distance of that ultimate goal. And we agree with the Honorable J. Edgar Hoover, who stated in the April 1961 FBI Law Enforcement Bulletin that the way to fight it, communism, is to study it, understand it, and discover what can be done about it. We think that the only way to stop the communists is to create sufficient understanding soon enough among enough people as to what is really taking place all around us. So let's do our best within the limits that are practicable for this occasion to review the whole fantastic story step by step. A, the early background. Step 1. We must hunt the first steps largely in the shadows rather than in the substance of history, for the conspiracy is deep-rooted. 200 years ago, or during the last half of the 18th century, there were in Europe many secret societies with grandiose dreams of overthrowing all existing human institutions and of rising out of the resulting chaos as the all-powerful rulers of a new order of civilization. Of these groups, the Illuminati, founded in Bavaria by Adam Weishaupt on May 1, 1776, was undoubtedly the most important. Step number 2. By 1789, the Illuminati were already strong enough to have had a great deal to do with planning and precipitating the Holocaust known as the French Revolution. In that upheaval, we find many elements of communist strategy and purpose with which we are familiar today. One was the ruthless undermining of rulers and governments in order to destroy them. Another was the destruction of all religion by substituting the worship of reason in its place. You will remember that the revolutionaries erected in Paris a statue to the goddess of reason as a symbol of this change. A third element was the fomenting by a few professional agitators of mob action made to appear as a spontaneous uprising of the people. A fourth was the massive use of terror to silence all opposition. A fifth was the use of the manufactured smear to destroy the enemies of the revolution or its temporary leaders. And all of these objectives and methods, which sound like rehearsals for what is happening throughout the world today, had either been specifically set forth by Weishaupt for his Order of Illuminati, or were the practical applications of his program. 3. By 1795, the French Revolution had run its horrible course, and there was a gradual return even in France to traditional beliefs, values, and institutions. Although it led to the Napoleonic Wars, which for the next 20 years devastated so much of Europe, this revolutionary fire in France had failed to set off a continent-wide social conflagration as the Illuminati and similar groups had hoped and planned. And henceforth, the Illuminati observed even more closely than before the original Weishaupt instruction that the very existence of the order should be denied and kept secret at all costs. But the fact that the Illuminati were active at the end of the 18th century with a growing reach and influence in many countries is clearly proved in the detailed histories of Robison and the Abbé Barruel. And the short-lived Babeuf conspiracy reveals that other groups, though possibly allied or subsidiary to the Illuminati, were working for the same totally destructive purposes. 4. During the 19th century, some of these secret societies and subversive groups appear to have grown and coalesced into the communist conspiracy as we know it today. However hidden the controlling nerve centers may have been, by 1848, some of the activities and even organizational structures of the conspiracy were becoming visible. The first important declaration of purposes, using the name of communism as we understand the word today, was issued by Karl Marx in 1848. Communist plotting was at work to some extent in the numerous uprisings of that year, 1848, as it has been in almost all insurrections and wars involving European nations since that time. 5. But the communist movement is only a tool of the total conspiracy. As secret as the communist activities and organizations generally appear, they are part of an open book compared to the secrecy enveloping some higher degree of this diabolic force. The extrinsic evidence is strong and convincing that by the beginning of the 20th century, there had evolved an inner core of conspiratorial power able to direct and control subversive activities which were worldwide in their reach, incredibly cunning and ruthless in their nature, and brilliantly far-sighted and patient in their strategy. Whether or not this increasingly all-powerful hidden command was due to an unbroken continuation of Weishaupt's Illuminati, or was a distillation from the leadership of this and other groups, we do not know. Some of them may never have been communists, while others were. To avoid as much dispute as possible, therefore, let's call this ruling clique simply the insiders. But we do need some such term for both clarity and convenience. And it should be recognized that always pushing and promoting each other into higher positions on every road to power and wealth and fame has been a vital part of the strategy of this fraternity from the beginning, and of the motivation of its members at any given time. The goal for each generation of conspirators, the tie that bound them together, lay in what this self-perpetuating body was to become, but the contemporary reward and satisfaction was in the becoming. 6. For more than 100 years now, the conspiracy had pushed on steadily along many avenues, all leading to the one goal of world rule. During the last half of the 19th century, the insiders were using the communists, the anarchists, the socialists of various hues and kinds, and dozens of other groups to promote their purposes. Many of these groups were largely unconscious of how they were being spurred on and guided by a few clever insiders. While under the guise of humanitarianism and in the pretended promotion of freedom and equality and brotherhood, these insiders and the gullible idealists who served as their dupes were busily undermining the very beliefs and institutions which made the 19th century a high watermark of such civilization as man has laboriously achieved. One broad avenue down which these conspiratorial forces advanced was known as progressive legislation. The very same collectivist theories and demagogic pretenses which had destroyed earlier civilizations were now paraded forth in the disguise of new and modern concepts. What Pisistratus had done in Athens in the 6th century BC, with the leverage of his vaunted concern for the working classes, Bismarck now began in Germany by basically the same approach. The controls which Diocletian had imposed on the Roman people 1,600 years before, entirely for the good of the people themselves, you understand, were now matched by one socialistic regime in France after another. And in England, the advance of government paternalism caused Herbert Spencer to comment that the ultimate result of protecting fools from their own folly must be to fill the planet full of fools. Now, this great and growing stream of socialistic legislation was made possible, of course, by idealists with only the noblest of intentions, combined with or led by venal politicians with no more nefarious objectives than glory and pelf for themselves. In the rotting French Republic of 1900 AD, as in the rotting Roman Empire of 300 AD, most of the rot was introduced in the name of progress. Most of the people of Europe and America, for the past 100 years, for instance, have gradually been led to believe fervently that everything in the way of security legislation, from the first Workmen's Compensation Acts under Bismarck to the latest Medicare monstrosity under Lyndon Johnson, was a proof of their own nobility of outlook. And this is not the place to go into any discussion as to which pieces of the mosaic may really have been justified and worthwhile. For unrecognized by the visionary do-gooders and even by the opportunistic politicians who alike were inveigled into pushing along this new humanitarianism, was the constant thread of its hidden purpose. That actual purpose was, on the part of the instigators who contrived it, always and by all means to reduce the responsibilities and rights of individual citizens while steadily increasing the quantity, the reach, and the potential tyranny of governments. This was the real long-range goal of the insiders who designed and controlled the movement, but who had realized from the beginning that communism must largely be advanced by non-communists who know not what they are doing. In the United States, with its remaining pioneer spirit and ubiquitous opportunities, the season was not yet ripe for offering this mess of pottage. And timing is always an essential part of communist strategy. But there was still plenty that could be done as a part of the grand design. So by 1914, the insiders, with comparatively few agents, but tremendous influence and cunning, had already brought about in our own country such decisively important measures in their program as central banking, a graduated personal income tax, and the direct election of senators. The brilliantly contrived central banking apparatus was called the Federal Reserve System. As in the case of the graduated income tax, its long-range significance and use could be well hidden under the pretended objectives at the time of its founding. And its ultimate value to the conspirators could be tremendously enhanced by the character and ability of the good men drawn into its top positions during the early decades of its existence. But what this function and prestige of the Federal Reserve System would inevitably come to mean in time and in actual practice was the control of credit, the control of the money supply, the ability to spend with increasing profligacy, and the means to steal continuously from the people by the debasement of our currency on the part of the federal government. And we have reached the stage today where all of these results have visibly come to pass. That the communists have now established their formal rule over almost half the peoples, and their informal but preponderant influence over almost all of the governments of the whole earth. The exceptions to the latter category include Spain, Portugal, West Germany, South Africa, Rhodesia, Nicaragua, Paraguay, nationalist China, New Zealand, and Australia, but not, unfortunately, the United States. Although at least 98% of all federal employees are, we believe, entirely loyal and patriotic, the communists and the insiders above them, who of course include some communists, now have full working control over our government because of the prestige and position and influence of this other 2%. Our greatest problem in getting people to understand this picture derives from the fact that what we are dealing with is nothing more nor less than a gigantic conspiracy, and that the controlling order, which we have dubbed the insiders, has given more careful attention and ruthless enforcement to keeping its very existence a secret than to any other objective in its whole satanic program. Anybody who even starts to point out the truth is mercilessly ridiculed as a believer in the conspiratorial theory of history. And anybody who approaches too close to an authoritative exposure of the higher levels of the conspiracy meets the fate of a William Morgan, a Dr. William Wirt, or a Joe McCarthy, a fate which is visibly intended for ourselves. Section D, and maybe worse to come, Step number 27. So now let's move out of the past for a quick and much too concise look at the present. The one great job left for the communists is the subjugation of the people of the United States. Even with the help of all the power of our government, which the communists already own, and with the brazen coercion and insidious bribery for which that power is now being used, the insiders do not underrate the magnitude of this undertaking. They leave no stone unturned and must be patient enough to run no risk of failure. So their exhaustive strategy for achieving their final goal includes the following methods. A, the deliberate and insidious breaking down of all morality and of every sound sense of values. B, the distortion and destruction of religious influences, especially on the lives of the young. C, the constant indoctrination of young and old alike through our educational system and through our communications and entertainment media in a preference for, quote, welfare and security, unquote, against responsibility and opportunity. D, making an ever larger and larger percentage of American industry, commerce, agriculture, education, and individuals accustomed to receiving and dependent on government checks. E, a constant increase in legislation, taxation, and bureaucracy, leading directly towards 100% government. F, the gradual conversion by judicial fiat of our republic into a democracy as the one best legalistic road to a mobocratic dictatorship. G, the creation of riots and the semblance of revolution under the guise and excuse of promoting civil rights. H, developing this Negro revolutionary movement, as the communists describe it, into a broader proletarian revolution of the have-nots against the haves. I, destroying the power of local police forces to preserve law and order. J, carrying on and steadily escalating a completely phony foreign war in Vietnam. Phony because the communists are actually running both sides of it, as an excuse for gradually establishing more and tighter government controls over every detail of our daily lives. K, under carefully contrived conditions of famine and the threat of starvation, using ration cards as leverage to bribe and coerce the heads of families to submit to a communist regime, exactly as was done by Menshikov in Poland and by the followers of Madame Sun Yat-sen in China. And L, eventually bringing about, quote, peace, unquote, a few years from now, by surrendering all remaining American sovereignty to the United Nations and enabling that communist one-world government to police our country with foreign troops and mercilessly suppress all opposition with exactly the same cruelties and terror that have already been used in dozens of other countries. Except for the threat of famine, which has still been well hidden from the American people, you can see all of these things taking place today all around you. If you have not been too blinded by communist propaganda, you will understand that they are not just happening as a result of natural causes, but are the product of long, extensive, brilliant, and ruthless planning by the evil forces which seek to destroy us. And the only thing which can possibly prevent a successful culmination of these communist plans is exposure. The one thing no conspiracy can withstand is the light of day on its activities. If enough people can be brought in time to see and understand that it is happening here, now, the process can still be stopped and the chains thrown off before the shackling is complete. But more tiny chains of every kind are now being added every month, and time is running short. To prevent this arousing of the American people before it is too late, the communists are counting on certain basic accomplishments of their long-range strategy and its supporting propaganda. We list those basic accomplishments below with a few comments that seem in order. A, the fundamentally decent American mind has been blinded to the fact that any group of men can be so evil and so completely devoid of all conscience as the communists and the insiders above them. The only remedy for this mental blindness is sufficient study of the conspiratorial activities and massive cruelties which have brought the world to its present state. B, many Americans feel that the whole battle is an ideological one. This is exactly what the communists want us to believe. They will go to any lengths and even subsidize their opposition to maintain the appearance that this is a war of ideas. For the communists wish above all else to distract your attention from the workings of the conspiracy. And there are conservatives who will still be ridiculing the conspiratorial theory of history and feeling that we simply have to win a vast debate with the liberals if a few years from now the armed police of a central tyranny knock on the door at 2 o'clock in the morning and haul them away to some unknown destination. Today, they're like a man accepting the invitation of a thug who says to him, "Let's you and me argue heatedly over our disagreements while my partner is slipping up behind your back to cut your throat." C, there are now another huge number of Americans who, aware of the menace of the communist conspiracy, believe that the major danger lies in a surprise attack from communist military forces. The communists have been working steadily for many years to make this threat appear realistic, for it not only draws attention away from the takeover by internal subversion, which is going on steadily all of the time, but it actually serves as an excuse for the seizure of more reins of power and the establishment of more controls by the very agents of the conspiracy who are carrying out this conquest by subversion. What our frightened fellow citizens in this category fail to realize, what some of our most patriotic military leaders, because of the very nature of their training, simply refuse to recognize, is that today Moscow and Washington are, and for many years have been, but two hands of one body controlled by one brain. You do not have your left hand fight your right hand or go through the motions of doing so unless it is to amuse or deceive children or to distract their attention from other matters while you're putting them to sleep. And these observations clearly apply to the show that is now being staged in Vietnam. D, there are also millions of Americans who now have a vested interest, intellectual, social, or even financial, in the falsehoods which they have gradually absorbed from insidious and carefully disguised communist propaganda. To stand up now and admit I was wrong would hurt not only their pride, but perhaps their reputations as knowledgeable sophisticates among their country club friends or their business associates. So they become daily more willful and more adamant in refusing to recognize the communist poisons in the mental fare they have been accepting and spreading all around them. Let's hope that they do not have to find insight, wisdom, and repentance easier to come by in a concentration camp. E. Finally, we have the problem of a very considerable number of spineless jellyfish going around among us wearing human clothes. They are aware of what is happening. They do not know whether it can be stopped or not. But if so, they murmur quietly to themselves, "Let George do it. I do not want to become involved." These people feel that by not opposing communism, they will be safer from recrimination if and when the actual takeover arrives and the police state terror begins. In this attitude, they are not only cowards, but fools. For Lenin himself gave them the answer to that false hope in his order to the secret police, which appeared in Pravda on December 25, 1918. It reads as follows, quote, "We are not waging war against separate individuals. We are exterminating the bourgeoisie as a class. Do not ask for incriminating evidence to prove that the prisoner opposed the Soviet government, either by arms or word. Your first duty is to ask him what class he belongs to, what were his origin, education, and occupation. These questions should decide the fate of the prisoner. This is the meaning and essence of Red Terror," unquote. And the only change in communists since Lenin's day is that they have become infinitely more powerful. Finally, ladies and gentlemen of our listening or reading audience, our whole story can best be summarized in one vernacular and very earthy expression. In the 20th century, modern man is simply being played for a sucker by an immoral gang of sophisticated criminals. These cunning megalomaniacs seek to make themselves the absolute rulers of a human race of enslaved robots in which every civilized trait has been destroyed. The insiders at the top and all their communist minions constitute only a tiny percentage of the race they plan to rule. Although they now occupy most of the positions of great prestige and influence in Washington and London and Paris, as well as in the financial, educational, and publishing circles of the whole world, their power rests entirely on bluff, pretense, and deception. Both their success and their purposes are contrary to the whole current of human history. They are sitting precariously on the gigantic powder keg of all honest human emotions. Despite their arrogant assurance on the contemporary scene, they themselves are well aware that sooner or later the whole framework of their cruel power will be broken.
"And in the days of these kings shall the God of heaven set up a kingdom, which shall never be destroyed. And the kingdom shall not be left to other people, but it shall break in pieces and consume all these kingdoms. And it shall stand forever,